You're listening to Stories from the Presbyterian Pew. This podcast is a resource of Advocacy from the Presbyterian Pew, a 501c3 nonprofit dedicated to educating lay people in the PCA, the Presbyterian Church in America, about PCA church government and process. On our website, we offer free, self-paced courses to help you understand the Book of Church Order, the BCO. These courses cover how the BCO works in theory, but what does it actually look like in practice? Stories from the Presbyterian Pew gives you an opportunity to hear directly from those who have walked through or observed what happens when the wheels of church process are set in motion. The stories we share are all true and all happened in PCA churches. All names and place names have been changed to protect the identities of the storytellers and others who play a role in their stories. Our goal is to facilitate understanding and awareness. Think of these stories as case studies, embodied and brought alive by the voices of our storytellers. On today's episode, we're joined by a new guest, Lane. She and her husband got a firsthand taste of what it's like to try to navigate the PCA church process on your own and how confusing that can be. One of the things Lane references in her story is filing a complaint. If you've been around the PCA for a while, you probably know that the PCA has structures in place to provide oversight and accountability for churches and church courts. One of these processes is called a complaint. Complaints are written statements about a specific action of a church court, such as a session, and they're required to be filed within 60 days of the action that is being complained against. Sometimes genuine concerns get ruled out of order and not addressed because the person filing the complaint doesn't know the ins and outs of navigating the PCA church process. Lane also mentions requesting the session minutes that pertain to her. As you'll hear in this episode, this wasn't something that Lane was aware that she could do. Most people aren't aware. Unfortunately, there isn't uniformity across the PCA about who has access to what records from what sessions and presbyteries and how to go about requesting that. These situations illustrate part of the reason advocacy from the Presbyterian Pew exists. Yes, the PCA has structures in place to provide oversight and accountability. But if the average person in the pew doesn't know how to make use of those processes, doesn't know how to navigate them effectively, or, as is often the case, doesn't even know that they have options at their disposal, how thorough is that accountability, really? While I'm certainly not the person who has all the answers, I'm so thankful to be connected to folks who have a lot more knowledge and experience with the PCA process than I do. So if you are experiencing or potentially navigating some form of process in the PCA, I encourage you to reach out. We're here, even just to answer questions. And if you need, we can get you connected with someone who can help you write a complaint or respond to an action that's been taken against you. You don't have to handle this alone, and we hope that you won't. You can always use the contact form on our website to get in touch at presbyterianpew.org/contact. So to start out with, how did you come to be a part of a PCA church? What other church backgrounds did you have? And then how did you come in contact with PCA church government and the denomination?
Yeah, when I first moved to a major city for university, churches in the downtown area were actually quite sparse. These were in the days before Tim Keller was really honing in on moving to the city. And so there weren't a lot of churches in the downtown area. And so I actually ended up at a small Alliance church. It was more than an hour commute away from where I lived. And at the same time in university, I was actually quite formed by that young, restless, Reformed movement. And so after university, I went into full-time ministry. And this small church, this tiny church, was very supportive of my ministry. And then when my husband and I began having kids, we realized that going to church so far away was actually quite untenable. It became 6:30 in the morning on a Sunday to get to church on time to be able to serve. And I think increasingly we also found that we were headed in different directions theologically. We had been profoundly impacted by the ministry at Tim Keller, and we had wanted to find a church that was in the city that was within walking distance from us. And there were only two churches that we could actually doctrinally ascribe to within walking distance, and one of them was a PCA church. And so we actually spent 3 months at each church, and we ended up settling on Redeemer West. And Redeemer West was a site of a larger church called Redeemer Downtown.
So this was actually a new term for me as you and I began talking about your story. Can you help us to understand what it means for Redeemer West to be a, quote, site church? And what was the history there of Redeemer West being planted and all that?
Yeah, so Redeemer Downtown had been growing for many years, and there had initially been a desire to plant a church on the west end of my city. However, that church planter, he had come up from the US and he had come specifically to plant the church, but Redeemer Downtown senior pastor Dean had significant conflict with this church planter. And so the church planter ended up moving back, and Redeemer West ended up coming under the umbrella of Redeemer Downtown. Redeemer West, we still had our own teaching elders, but there was a shared session and a shared board. And there was one ruling elder, I believe, who was Redeemer West's representative, but the session made decisions as a whole for all of Redeemer. And my husband Manny and I, we hadn't been part of Redeemer West at the time that they experienced this conflict, and we had not been part of this failure to plant a church. But because we had been in ministry for many years, we had heard about some of what had happened. And when we became members at Redeemer West, it was made very clear to us that Redeemer West was not its own church, but that it was part of the larger Redeemer umbrella. At the same time, Redeemer West and Redeemer Downtown had very distinct flavors. Redeemer's Downtown had many members with high-paying jobs. Being part of a downtown church, it was close to the financial district. It was also close to numerous large hospitals. And so it attracted a lot of high-achieving Christians. And the senior pastor, Dean, himself had been a lawyer before becoming a teaching elder. And then on the other hand, Redeemer West, which was the site that we went to, was very different. It was filled with many congregants who were artists, who were writers, who were architects. And our main teaching elder, even Kenneth, is an artist himself. His children are artists. And our other teaching elder, James, he writes poetry. And so the two sites just have really distinct and very different personalities, which made sense based on where they were in the city.
So as you came from, you said you were in an alliance church, attracted originally to the PCA, maybe more doctrinally, but then as you began to be involved in a PCA church, what did you understand about PCA church government when you joined?
Yeah, I think coming from an alliance background, we understood very little about PCA church government when we joined the church. Growing up, we had been accustomed to a board of elders. My husband had served as an elder at our small alliance church for many years, but we took membership classes. And even in the membership classes, there was very little information on church governance. I actually, right before our call, I pulled out the document that we were given, that physical document that was given to us during membership classes right before the call. I looked through it again, and the bulk of the document actually just discusses the gospel and beliefs that were particular to Redeemer Downtown, which were not particular to, even though they were particular to Redeemer Downtown, we ascribed to those beliefs already. So heading into membership classes, because the focus was on the gospel and on certain doctrinal beliefs that we already ascribed to, we thought that becoming a member, there was no issue with us becoming a member. We had no understanding of the BCO. There was no definition in the document that we were given on what the BCO even was. It was quoted in its short form BCO instead of the Book of Church Order. But yeah, there was no information in that document on how church governance worked. Beyond, there was a small one-page section on submission to male leadership in the church.
And then because you had a background in ministry, you said that your site pastor, Kenneth, asked you to consider a position on staff at Redeemer West. So tell me a little bit about what this role was, what factors inclined you to accept the role, what made you perhaps a little hesitant about accepting, and then what did you ultimately decide to do?
Yeah. The role that Kenneth verbally asked me to consider was to be the woman shepherdess at Redeemer West. And my understanding was that it was to take on the role of just directing the women's ministry at Redeemer West and to disciple women. My role title on paper was Redeemer West Women's Discipleship. And so when Kenneth actually called me, I was really excited. At that time, I'd been in full-time parachurch ministry for the past 14 to 15 years, and I had been working with university students. And so I was really excited to just expand what I had loved doing already to serve our church. Redeemer West had walked with us through some really hard years, including a season where we had a miscarriage, where our second child almost died from an anaphylactic reaction, where our house flooded. And they had walked with us and loved us through that time. And so I was really eager to actually give back to Redeemer West and also just do what I love doing, discipling women. I was already doing it at church on an unofficial basis. And so just to be able to do it on an official basis was really exciting. I did, however, have reservations about working for Redeemer as a whole. I had seen some people come out of Redeemer Downtown just really broken. Its reputation was that it did pursue excellence, but that being image driven had a cost. And I saw that cost that it had on some of the staff. And so even though we were quote unquote one church, I told Kenneth that if I took on the role, my paycheck I knew would be coming from Redeemer as a whole, and that I only wanted to serve our site, that I only wanted to serve Redeemer West. And Kenneth assured me that I would only be serving our site. And so because of that, I happily agreed to the role. And I signed the offer as soon as I received it.
And then pretty shortly into being officially in that role, there was something that came up that immediately caused some concern for you. Can you tell us about what happened there?
Yeah, the very first incident that occurred happened actually a week into me taking on the role. I posted what I thought was an unrelated article, unrelated to our church, on my Facebook page. And it was an article actually about the RZIM crisis. I don't know if you remember that, but in this article, it mentioned a specific mediator that RZIM had used. And it would later be discovered that this mediator had actually perpetrated and protected power imbalances through her mediation, and that she herself had perpetuated abuses by bullying her staff and actually sexually abusing two of the seminarians that she had taught and supervised. However, at this time that I had posted the article, these things were still unknown. So it was just the sheer mention of the mediator that had been involved in the RZIM crisis that flagged my church's leadership attention. And I was asked to take the article down immediately and was told that there were things that were going on that I didn't know about. And to quote my pastor, he said, "Things are about to blow up."
So when you posted that article, you were just thinking, this is general information. It's not directly connected to the church. Obviously, it's relevant to your role as discipling women. But after you were asked to take down that article, then you found out some more of the backstory, that there was a direct connection to something that had happened at the church. And you learned a little bit more about Adrienne Townsend, a former member of the church, and the accusations that she had made. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So after I took down that article, my pastor actually apologized that he had not onboarded me about the things that had been happening at Redeemer Downtown. But a couple, one of whom was on staff with Redeemer Downtown, and this couple had been one of the founding couples of the church, had accused Dean, the senior pastor, of the non-consensual touching of female staff members, and that he had failed to remain above reproach in his interactions with church staff. And I need to be clear that, one, the details are a bit fuzzy for me because I had just been onboarded at this time, and it's not my story to tell. And so I wasn't privy to many of the details that were happening at this time. But what my pastor did tell me was that the church had hired the same mediator that RZIM had used, which was problematic. That our church had hired the same mediator to deal with this conflict with the Townsends. And at this time, I didn't know the Townsends well. I had met them a few times over the years, but had very little stake in the game, except that when everything blew up, our church actually began to have emergency staff meetings. And these staff meetings were for Redeemer as a whole, not just for the staff of Redeemer Downtown. And in attending these meetings, I began to feel very uncomfortable about the way that the Townsends were talked about in the meetings. It was just, I don't even know if I could articulate it back then, but the way that they would talk about them, about them as people who had sinned against the church, it just didn't sit fully right with me.
And I appreciate you mentioning and acknowledging that this isn't your story to tell. We don't have all the details of what happened with the Townsends, but it is very relevant to your story and how things unfold. So that's why we're bringing in that thread. And again, going back to what you began learning, the Townsends had made accusations, and the presbytery at a certain point was involved with these accusations. Do you know what the presbytery's initial response was to the accusations?
Yes. Yeah. So Presbytery did become involved, and they began an investigation into the allegations. And Redeemer Downtown itself also hired a third party separate from Presbytery to do an investigation. And so these two investigations were running parallel to each other. And Presbytery's initial response was that Pastor Dean's actions did not rise to a chargeable offense. So they believed that he had not actually done anything inappropriate.
And then this third party investigation that was going on, what were the results of that?
Yeah, this third party actually found that the Townsend's accusations appeared to be credible. So basically, there were two different findings from two different investigations.
Interesting. So what did the Townsends do going forward to try to seek justice?
Yeah, when Presbytery declared that Dean's actions did not rise to a chargeable offense, I think the Townsends felt like they had reached the end of the road in terms of church mediation. And so they went the legal route and they sued Redeemer downtown, and the church settled. And with the settlement, the Townsends were actually asked to sign a non-disparagement clause, which was made very clear this is not the same as a non-disclosure agreement. But in reality, legally, it was quite similar. And then their church membership was also revoked. Again, these details are a little fuzzy for me because things were happening right at the time that I was onboarding. And I also was not familiar with PCA church polity, but it's my understanding now that was an illegal move. Like their church membership was not supposed to be revoked as retaliation.
Absolutely. That's not how church membership should be handled. Like you said, the presbytery didn't find that there was anything that rose to a chargeable offense. So they didn't have any kind of censures or requirements for Dean. But you said that the session of Redeemer downtown did impose some requirements on him. And what were those?
Yeah. So the requirement that the session imposed was that Dean take some sensitivity training.
And then also, as you're brand new in this role of director of women's ministry, obviously something pretty sensitive is unfolding at the church, obviously something that would be directly applicable to women and that women would be very concerned about. So you began right off the bat fielding a lot of questions. So tell me a little bit about that and how you were responding to these women that were coming to you with concerns.
Yeah, I had many people approaching me at Redeemer West asking what was happening downtown. For many of them, what they were hearing was very reminiscent of the trauma and the conflict that they had endured when Redeemer West was trying to become a church plant. Others had heard whispers of sexual assault allegations and had church gossip is a very real thing. And when there's no information being given, people jump to the worst possible scenario. And so there were a lot of women who were asking me, what's happening? Is Redeemer West a safe place for women to go to? Is Redeemer as a whole a safe place? And my initial response was always the same. Even when I had some interior doubts about those emergency meetings that were happening, my response was always, I know that our elders are working so hard for the church. And if you have any questions, you can ask them. And I know that they'll work hard to serve you.
And you had mentioned already that with all of this that was unfolding, the church system started to hold these emergency meetings for all of the staff, not just the Redeemer downtown, but Redeemer West as well. And these meetings were also creating some pretty large challenges for you. Can you tell us about how that unfolded?
Yeah. So whenever things were blowing up, whenever there was a move made by the Townsends or a reciprocal move made by the church would call emergency meetings. And in hindsight, these were almost like PR meetings. It was like the church was attempting to do damage control. But these meetings would always be called less than a day before the actual meeting was to take place. And in some cases, it would be just hours. And so being a mom of 3 young children, I would have to take time off work for my other job, or my husband would have to take time off work for his job, and I would have to find childcare. And I was told that I was sometimes told that it would be optional for me to go to these meetings because I was part of Redeemer West. And this was always something that struck me as a little bit humorous because it had been so drilled into us that Redeemer West was the same church as Redeemer Downtown. We were one church. But when it benefited Redeemer Downtown to lose a woman's voice in the discussion, we were suddenly different. And it's okay. Lane doesn't need to go to these emergency meetings because she works for Redeemer West.
So was there not a woman on staff at Redeemer downtown?
There were some women downtown. The women's ministry director at Redeemer downtown was retired. So her primary role was women's director at Redeemer downtown. And then there were many female interns who are young. It's their first foray into ministry.
So, in response to all of these emergency meetings, and especially the difficulty that they were posing for you as a person with a full-time job and 3 children to care for, you sent an email to your church leaders about this concern. And how did the church respond?
Yeah. So after these emergency meetings have been called multiple times, I had to secure childcare multiple times. I was done. I had so many people asking me questions, and I needed to be at these meetings in order to be able to give them good answers. And yet sometimes I couldn't make it to the meetings, and decisions would be made without me being present. And so I sent an email to the church leaders saying that it was highly inappropriate to be calling these meetings last minute, and that as a woman, I felt that this actually significantly impacted me more than men, because women are often primary caregivers. And additionally, it also impacted our church. It impacted Redeemer West to lose a voice, a woman's voice. And so I sent an email just saying, if we are going to have these meetings, I need more notice. It shows that the church does not value the voices of women when we aren't even getting them to the meetings that they need to be to. And the church responded and said, we apologize. We will make sure that this won't happen again. And that was about it.
And then another staff meeting was scheduled. And this particular one was on May the 5th. What was the purpose of this particular meeting?
Yeah, so we were told, so at this time, the senior pastor, Dean, had taken some paid time off of work, and he had also done his sensitivity training course. And so there was a meeting scheduled for May 5th where he was going to come and apologize to the church staff and field any questions they might have before he returned back to work.
And you had already mentioned that in your role, you were receiving a lot of questions from women, and you felt some, responsibility to be able to understand what was going on and answer those questions. So you said that the night before the meeting, you and your husband were discussing, should you ask a question? What should you ask? Tell me a little bit about preparing for that meeting.
Yeah, I think we had been concerned that sensitivity training was the only responsibility given to Pastor Dean, that it felt as though the sensitivity and behavioral training was purely behavioral and hadn't actually addressed some spiritual needs that we felt contributed to the situation as well. And so my husband and I actually planned out a question that I wrote down verbatim the night before the meeting. I don't do very well on the fly and thinking on the cuff, and I wanted to have something written down that I could ask in the moment about his return to work.
And one of the first things you shared with me when you were describing that meeting was Dean's explanation about why it was that he had inappropriately touched women. Can you tell us a little bit about his explanation?
Yeah, Dean said that being the pastor of a very large church, he was always in a hurry, especially in a large major city like the one we lived in. I put a tremendous pressure on him to be busy. And he said that in his busyness, he inappropriately touched women as a way to show them that they were valued and loved so that they would do what he wanted them to do. And so that was the explanation. It was hurry and busyness that had led him to inappropriately touch women.
And you said that you would be willing to share with us this question that you asked. And as you'd mentioned before, you wrote this down and you read it verbatim of exactly what you'd written down during the meeting. So can you read that to us so we can know what it was that you asked during that meeting?
Yeah. I wrote, Dean, I can appreciate it that it's been a tremendously hard time. I can appreciate your openness both in having this conversation today and in your public letter. Though not very well, you and I have known each other for many years. I feel like I know you enough to say that I know your heart is for Jesus and not malicious in any way. My concern, though, is that the recommendation for sensitivity training focuses on tips and managerial techniques instead of addressing potential deeper issues. This harassment issue aside, there have been other interpersonal issues, both past and ongoing. I think of the situation with Lansing, with the Townsends, with staff who have left on poor terms. I think of how it was raised at a town hall, a proclivity to preferential treatment of some congregants. I'm absolutely not bringing this up to hash them out right now. I know that in each case there is context and nuance, but my point is this. The fact that there have been multiple instances of interpersonal issues that have left others feeling objectified raises the question. Are there deeper growth areas of the heart or character that you are already aware of and hope to address beyond culturally relevant sensitivity and management training? To be clear, voicing this concern is not an attempt at an offensive towards Dean. I'm concerned that we would actually help Dean and our church flourish by addressing the root issues.
Yeah. Which seems an important and relevant question given his explanation of why he was inappropriately touching women, and that would perhaps even further raise your interest in wanting to know, are we addressing root causes here? Are we addressing the root of the problem?
Yes.
So how did, I'm sorry.
Oh, no, I just wanted to say that busyness is not an idol. Tim Keller talked a lot about our idols, but busyness is not, at least from my perspective, is not an idol. It's the result of a different idol. And so as Dean had shared, I'd been very curious. Oh, it's not actually busyness that made him touch women appropriately. What's going on beyond that? Yeah.
Exactly. So how did Dean respond to your question, and what was your impression of that response?
Yeah, he responded with two things. One was that he mentioned that alongside the sensitivity training, he had been going to counseling, and that the counseling had been very revealing for him. And the second response was that everyone has favorites. I have favorites, you have favorites, we all have favorites. And if we say that we don't have favorites, we're lying. And so those were the two responses. And you know what? My impression of the response regarding counseling, I was quite satisfied. I didn't know what was going on in his heart. And because I didn't know Dean very well, there was no way for me to ascertain whether or not it had been helpful. But just even knowing that there had been something beyond sensitivity training, the mandated sensitivity training, at least made me feel a little better about him returning to work. In terms of my impression to his other response, that we all have favorites, I was not the greatest. I was not the greatest fan of that response, and it probably did show on my face.
Yeah, understandable. So just to provide a little extra context, were either your site pastor, Kenneth, or the assistant pastor, James, at this meeting on May the 5th?
Our site pastor was not present at the meeting on May the 5th. He had the death of someone in his family, and so he was actually present for that. Our assistant pastor, James, was there. He was not a member at that point. He was not a member of the session, and there was only one member of the session present at that meeting, and that was the moderator of the meeting.
And then after the meeting was over, Dean spoke to you informally, privately, and what did he say at that time?
Yeah, he approached me and he said, "Hey, Lynn, I just want to make sure that you and I are okay." And I said to him, "Yeah, I think so." And he said that my question had been quite charged. And I told him, I said, if I had an issue with you personally, I would come to you personally to deal with it. I posed the question because I really did mean the words that I said, that I wanted to help him flourish and I wanted our church to flourish. And we left on what I thought were good terms. And even later on, about a year later, when we saw him in person, he said, "Oh, I thought we left that meeting in good terms as well." So the two of us thought that we had both left on good terms.
And then, so interestingly, you felt like things wrapped up well. Apparently, Dean felt like things wrapped up well. And then later that day, you got a phone call from Mark. Now, if I'm understanding this correctly, Mark was not at the meeting, but Mark was the ruling elder on the Redeemer downtown session that was assigned to be the representative for Redeemer West. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. So Mark, this ruling elder that is assigned to Redeemer West, called you later that day. And what transpired when he called?
Yeah. So when Dean and I left the meeting, we both thought that it had ended on good terms, but I still had many questions. I wasn't fully satisfied with where things had landed, but I did feel like I had enough information to go back to the people that I had been working with and give them some answers. And so then I was really surprised when Mark called, because Mark had not been, like you said, at that May 5th meeting. And he called and said, you know what? I am highly concerned about what I have heard, the reports that I've heard from the meeting on May 5th. He told me that I had been overly critical of our senior pastor, and that between that and the email that I had written the day prior, that he was concerned about where I was at.
And he mentioned something about, in addition to your question, he mentioned something about a question that James, the assistant pastor, had asked at the meeting.
Yes, James, the assistant pastor, had asked a question about whether we could elevate the voices of women. Situations of abuse, they disproportionately affect women. And so James had asked a question about whether it was possible, even though we are a complementarian denomination, James had asked whether it was possible or not to just elevate the voices of women, to give them more training, to provide some resources, to send them to seminary, so that we could give women more agency and perhaps prevent situations like this in the future. And so it was actually a really good question. But between James's question, my email the night before, Mark was concerned that Redeemer West was going rogue, that we were becoming divisive, and that for me in particular, that I had a desire to be overly critical and divisive.
And had Mark already talked to James at this point about his question?
Yes, Mark had talked to James, and James had repented for his question. James had told Mark that the question that I had asked in the May 5th meeting was a really good question, and James had felt as though he should ask a good question as well on behalf of our church, and that James repented for asking the question without a good heart, a proper heart to back up his question. And so at this point, Mark was only concerned about me. And we had this conversation. It was quite lengthy. And by the end, again, I thought that I had satisfied him with my answers. One of the questions that he had asked was, Lane, why were you the one to ask this question? Which I remember thinking in my mind during this call, I don't know. I can't read the minds of other people, so how could I know why I was the one to answer the question? What I did tell him was that for me, it was my, I think, 15th year of ministry, full-time ministry, and I had seen a lot in those 15 years. And so I felt the freedom to ask that question. I also probably felt a freedom that interns who had to work directly with Dean probably didn't feel the freedom to ask, whereas I was at a site and didn't need to see Dean day in and day out. And so that probably lent itself to me having the freedom to ask that question versus perhaps an intern or a young female staff.
So again, second conversation of the day that was okay. That was a little awkward, but seemed by the end of it like it was wrapping up well, but that wasn't the end of it. So that evening you got an email from Mark. So tell me about that email.
Yeah, I got an email from Mark stating that he was still concerned, that I was overly critical and divisive, and yeah, that we needed to further discuss this. Multiple times I had asked Mark in our phone call, and then I followed up his email with the question, can you tell me what specifically that I said was critical and divisive? Especially since Mark had not been present at the meeting, I wanted to know from Mark where he got this perception that I was overly critical and divisive. And the only thing he could say to me was, I was not present at this meeting, so I don't know, but this is what I've been told. I did ask Mark, because our assistant pastor, James, had been present at the meeting. After conversing with Mark, I called James and I said, James, did I seem critical in that meeting? Like, we were at the same meeting. Did I come off as being overly critical? Did I come off as being divisive? And James said, no, your question was a really great question. I called James's brother, who also works for the downtown site. And James's brother said the same thing. I walked out of that meeting with James, and we both agreed that we were so grateful that you had vocalized your concerns. And we walked out of there saying, yeah, that was a great response. I even asked another person who I didn't know very well that I was in contact with, hey, was I divisive? Did I sound angry? How did I sound in that meeting? And he was like, no. He was like, you didn't sound divisive at all. He even offered, he said, you know what? I have notes from the meeting. I took notes from the whole meeting. I have your question written down. I can send you those notes if you want. And so from 3 people that I had reached out to, there had been no issues. And I told this to Mark. I said, Mark, there are 3 people who were at that meeting who I've asked if I sounded divisive, and all 3 people have said, no. I'm wondering where you've gotten the idea that I've been divisive. And again, the same answer. I was not there at this meeting. I can't tell you specifically what you did wrong. And so that's where Mark and I left off.
So understandably, at this point, you're a little bit at a loss for how to continue to address it because he's not even able to give you any specifics that you could respond to. So you reached out to Kenneth, your site pastor, and James, the assistant site pastor. What did you share with them? What was their advice to you at this time?
Yeah. So I shared with them everything that had happened. And Kenneth's response was great. Kenneth was like, you know what? I think this is just a big miscommunication. Let's all get into the room at the same time and let's meet. And I'm sure that we can hash this out. He was like, in the meantime, don't respond to Mark. Just while we're setting up this meeting, it seems like you're going back and forth and that it won't be helpful via email. So why don't we just all get into the same room? We'll meet and we'll hash this out. Kenneth even offered that I could bring my husband, Manny, with me as a support.
So tell me about this meeting with Mark. Who all was present? What unfolded?
So at this meeting with Mark, obviously Mark was present, Kenneth was present, James was, and myself and my husband. At this meeting, the same thing happened again. Lane, you've been overly critical. You have been divisive. I am concerned. If you continue to be divisive, Redeemer West will not be able to become its own church. We require trust. We require trust, and it is clear that you were overly critical and divisive in that meeting. And every time I would ask, can you show me how? Can you tell me how? Can I read the question to you? And can you tell me what was wrong with what I asked? The response would be, I can't tell you. I wasn't there, but just hearing the question shows me that you are divisive. If you asked this question in a presbytery meeting, it would have been called out of order so quickly. Why would it have been called out of order? What was wrong with the question? There was no response. At the end of the meeting, Mark was yelling at me and he left the meeting yelling, I have proof from people who were at the meeting. I have witnesses that say that you were critical and divisive. But again, who? He wasn't able to provide those answers.
So one of the things that struck me, and I think that struck you when you were sharing about that meeting, is that there was this elevation of, this is no longer just, oh, Lane, you have problems, but now your problems are being extrapolated to all of Redeemer West. And like, you are going to prevent this church from being able to be particularized because like you're poisoning the relationship between Redeemer West and Redeemer Downtown. Oh, tell me about the conversation that led to with Kenneth after the meeting.
Yeah, I think the line was, without trust, there's no particularization. And so I told Kenneth after the meeting, I said, I think I need to quit my job. I told him I really love discipling women at Redeemer West, but I don't want to be the fall person and take on the responsibility of Redeemer West not being able to particularize. And Kenneth, he agreed. He said, he asked me to take some time to think and pray about my decision. And he told me that he would support me in whatever that decision was. But he said he couldn't understand why it seemed like the session was disciplining me. And he couldn't understand what they were disciplining me for.
So did you eventually decide to resign or just stay in your position?
Yeah. So after 2 weeks, I decided to resign. And during that time, it was radio silence from Mark and from the rest of the session. And even after I resigned, I received an email that said, clear out your inbox. You will lose access to your email. So please save whatever you need to. And I think I had offered a 2 weeks notice with my resignation, and I was told that wasn't needed. My services were no longer required. And all of these emails came from Redeemer Downtown.
And so then even after this meeting and even you resigning from your position, you and your husband still made attempts to try to resolve this issue with Mark. Tell me a little bit about what you did there.
Yeah, we tried multiple times. We would message Mark saying, hey, you know what? We have outstanding conflict. Can we resolve it? What can we do? It was silence. We emailed Redeemer Downtown. What can we do? Radio silence. Eventually, Redeemer Downtown asked us if it would be okay if they involved the Presbytery Shepherding Committee. They felt as though we were at an impasse. And so could they involve the Shepherding Committee? And one of the things that my husband and I throughout this time had requested was that the elder who had been present for the May 5th meeting, the one session member who had been present for the May 5th meeting, we had asked that whatever meetings we had, that he would be involved in those meetings too, because he was the only session member who could actually relay from his perspective what had happened. And I hadn't talked to this session member. I had no clue what he was relaying to the rest of the session. I had no clue what he had been relaying with Mark. And so I asked this session member, that was our request. He needs to be present for this meeting, and all parties involved need to be present. And Redeemer Downtown was unwilling to do that. This one elder was unwilling to be part of these meetings. And so we really did. I agree with Redeemer Downtown that we had reached an impasse. And so when they said, can we involve the shepherding committee? My husband and I were like, yes, let's involve them because we need a way forward.
So the shepherding committee of the Presbytery did get involved, which you were glad to hear and glad to have their help with this. What did they say should be your next step after they evaluated the situation?
Yeah, like our pastor, Kenneth, they agreed that they said, you know what, all of this sounds like a big miscommunication. If we could all just get in a room together, we could solve this. And I think they even in one email said, we think that we could solve it within 2 hours. This whole conversation could be done with in a few hours. And I agreed. And they agreed as well that the one elder who had been present during the May 5th meeting, the shepherding committee agreed that he needed to be present for these meetings as well. So they agreed that he ought to be present and wrote it in their letter to us and to Redeemer Downtown. Unfortunately, Redeemer Downtown did not acquiesce, and they told us that he would not be present for the meetings. And because of that, Manny and I decided, no, we can't have closure without him there. We can't have another meeting where session members tell us, we don't know what you did wrong. We weren't at this meeting, but you did something wrong. And so it was very important to us that he be there, and the shepherding committee agreed. But unfortunately, Redeemer Downtown said no, he would not be present.
So both you and your husband and the shepherding committee are on the same page that, like, if this one session member, the only session member who was at the May 5th meeting, if he's not going to participate, then you're still at an impasse because Mark can't provide any information and there's really no way forward. So what did the shepherding committee say that you should do at this point?
So the shepherding committee recommended that we actually file a formal complaint against Redeemer. Once the shepherding committee advised us to file a complaint, Manny and I set to work. The thing to note is that we had no clue what a complaint was. We had no clue about anything from the BCO. We did not know anything about PCA church governance and what to do when filing a complaint. And so we wrote up a complaint based on what we had experienced. And our complaint was of 2 things. The first thing was improper setup, facilitation, and follow-up of that May 5th staff meeting. that it had been short notice, that it had an unclear purpose and expectations, that there had been a single ruling elder present, but who claimed to not represent the session. And there was a lack of debrief and proper report of that meeting. So that was one of our complaints. And the second part was that I was alleged to be a divisive individual without clear evidence. So that I was accused, I'm just reading this out here, accusing Lane of trapping the session at the May 5th meeting, that I had been purposely trying to trap them, attributing to Lane a critical spirit through secondhand hearsay coming out of the staff meeting without offering concrete reason, and placing the burden of Redeemer West's ability to particularize on Lane's level of trust or lack thereof. So that was our complaint. And as a part of that, we also wrote that a part of the complaint was an unwillingness on the part of that ruling elder to meet and resolve this ongoing conflict, and a complete lack of follow-up by the Redeemer session, a lack of shepherding and care and conversation, and a lack of taking responsibility and passing the blame onto different elders following that in-person conversation that we had with Mark. So passing the blame despite serious allegations of me being divisive and having a critical spirit, and that those actions or I guess lack thereof, had led to emotional and spiritual trauma. And so that was our complaint that we submitted.
And then just a note for anybody listening who is not familiar with PCA process, which is frankly most of us, because this can be really hard to navigate. The way that complaints work is that you first file the complaint with the body that you're complaining against. In this case, for example, Lane and Manny would file the complaint with the church session first to give them a chance to respond. So that's what they did. They filed the complaint with the session. And what was the church's response to the complaint?
Our church's response to the complaint was that our complaint was out of order because it was not actually a complaint, and that it didn't fulfill the requirements in the BCO of what a complaint actually is.
So you had followed the advice that the shepherding committee gave you. They said, this is the next thing you need to do is you need to file a complaint. And did you have anybody say to you, like, we will show you how to write a complaint, or we will help you write the complaint? Were there any resources suggested for how you could figure out how to write a complaint?
No, there was nothing. We just set to work writing whatever we knew how to write. Yeah.
After the complaint was denied by the church session, what happened next?
So after the complaint was denied by the church session, we felt like we had to escalate the complaint to Presbytery. We were told that we could do that. And so we escalated the complaint to Presbytery. And we also we had discovered in this time that we could actually request the minutes that were pertinent to our case. And so we requested the minutes, requested the session minutes. Wherever we were mentioned in those minutes, we requested the written documentation.
Yes, and that's absolutely correct. You definitely had the right to do that. And it's a very good thing that you did, because you made a rather unpleasant discovery when you got those minutes. Yes, we're leaving you with a bit of a cliffhanger at the end of today's episode, but this was a good place to take a break. And next week, Lane will be back to tell us about what she discovered when the session handed over the minutes that she and her husband requested, and what they did next. Thank you for listening to today's episode. Stories from the Presbyterian Pew is a resource of Advocacy from the Presbyterian Pew, a 501c3 nonprofit. We are 100% volunteer run and 100% donor supported. We want to keep this podcast ad-free, but in order to do that, we need the financial support of listeners like you. To make a one-time or recurring contribution, please visit presbyterianpew.org/donate. If you are interested in learning more about the governing document of the PCA, the Book of Church Order, please check out our free self-paced courses at presbyterianpew.org/courses. And if you have a question about PCA church government or something you have experienced in a PCA church, you can reach out through the form on our website at presbyterianpew.org/contact. Towards hope and healing, I'm Lynna Sutherland with Advocacy from the Presbyterian Pew.